This is Disaster and After, how we face the worst and build what's next.
Tell people I made a career of going to the nicest places at the worst possible times, but it was enormously rewarding.
Disaster confronts us with the sudden, the violent, the unpredictable. It reveals the limits of our systems and our own fragility. After the storm comes a choice. This is a conversation with retired Admiral Brian Flynn, a pioneer in the world of disaster mental health. So welcome back to Disaster and After. I'm having conversations with Dr. Brian Flynn, and in our last conversation, we were talking about the Columbine school shooting and your travel to meet with grieving families. And I think those kinds of experiences, as you shared, can really, they affect you personally. And I know kind of you did a lot of other things and have had quite a journey in terms of the work you've done you traveled to Kenya and Tanzania after the bombing of the U.S. embassies, and you were on site shortly after the September 11th attacks. And, you and I worked together in some of those efforts. So, you eventually made the decision to step back from field deployments and going on site in that way. Tell me a little bit about kind of how you began to know it was time to make that change.
I don't think it was anything sudden. I think it was a process over time. And I don't think it had completely to do with the work. It had to do with my role. Right. I love the work. As you mentioned, I feel enormously privileged to have been able to do the kind of work that I did, even though sometimes I tell people I made a career of going to the nicest places at the worst possible times. But it was enormously rewarding. And I wouldn't trade a minute of it, even the most stressful parts of it. But I think it takes a toll over time, and I was feeling that. I was feeling that I wasn't excited and energetic about going out anymore. I was thinking, I was see on TV that there had been a fire or an earthquake or something. I was relieved when I saw that it was in another country and I didn't have to go, or I didn't have to have my staff mount a response to that. And that's not the way to be. Right. That was a message to me, an indicator that it may be time. The other thing is I was getting older, it's taxing. It's physically tiring, psychologically tiring. I was increasingly aware that I had missed times with my family, that I hadn't been there for my kids, my wife, the way I would like to be. There's always that conflict. Again, I wouldn't change it, but I wanted to change the balance. The other thing that was happening is, as you've experienced, I'm sure, the higher I went in the hierarchy and higher I went in rank, there were lots of wonderful things that came with that. But the things that weren't so wonderful is I wound up spending a lot of my time and energy doing things that weren't much fun, that I really didn't particularly like doing or felt that I was particularly good at. And so I found a disproportionate amount of my time on budgets, personnel issues, space issues, those kinds of things that very important, but things that weren't, to me, very, very satisfying. So I decided that it was time for me not to leave the field, but to rebalance my life. I desperately wanted to stay in the field, but I wanted to stop doing direct response work. And I wanted to stop running things. I wanted to stop supervising people, and running programs and preparing budgets and all those things that, make us twitch sometimes. But so I decided to do that, and so I left the public health service, and I had worked throughout my disaster career with the Center for Studies of Traumatic Studies at Uniformed Services University, and so after a period of independent consulting, they invited me to join them. but I capped my professional work at 50% time, which was an important decision for me. It changed the nature of my disaster work. I wasn't responding anymore, but had a chance to think.
Right.
I had a chance to write, to consult, to teach, all those kinds of things that really I thought could help me make a much more age-appropriate contribution than chasing disasters. Right. And it worked out that way. It was a wonderful work experience with great colleagues. It expanded my knowledge. I think I brought something to that organization that was quite different than what they had. So I can't say enough about how much I appreciate that opportunity.
Just going to ask you a question that kind of came up out of that, and maybe this is where you were going, or maybe not. You talked about, so we think back, you talked about Hurricane Andrew being the most personally challenging, and really a lot of the times when I hear you a theme, it's the things that were really the hardest was when the systems were not working, or when the systems were not talking to each other, or there were administrative issues. So I'm just curious also about I know you did some work to kind of then begin trying to bridge behavioral health and emergency management in some new ways. And I wonder if you could tell a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's certainly one of the lessons I learned in all of these years of disaster work is if there was a close relationship between emergency management, meaning FEMA, who I was working with most closely, and behavioral health issues, magic happened. Wonderful things happened if that relationship was working well. If that relationship was non-existent or was hostile or disrespectful, things fall apart. Almost nothing good could happen in that circumstance. So I became very much aware that this was a critical variable that very few people were talking about. And the timing was right. I got approached by Elsevier Publishing asking if I would write a book on that topic. So I agreed to do it as long as I could co-edit the book with somebody who was more experienced and an expert in disaster management, emergency management than I was. And so Ron Sherman and I collaborated on that. He was a senior FEMA leader. He was one of the federal coordinating officer cadre, the president's representative on site. Very senior, experienced guy. And so we did this book together. And again, it was a lot of work. We chose a design that was very labor intensive, but it came out. I don't mind talking about the book because I don't get anything out of it. I signed all the royalties to the Jackson Foundation for Military Medical Research. So I don't get anything out of it except the satisfaction of knowing that this book is now used in a lot of graduate programs in emergency management. And it's on a topic that they don't get much exposure to. So again, part of my theme in this second career of mine was to take what I knew, this very unique experience that I had, and translate it in different ways so that there was some continuity, and so that you and I have worked together for many years. We've had a big gap in recent years, but it's you and people younger than you are that has empowered me to do these kinds of things. That's what I want to do. Is I feel extraordinarily fortunate to have had the experiences I had, and I wanted to and continue to want to figure out ways to pass that knowledge on.
I think the idea of co-editing with someone from emergency management, like a senior person, is so important in the sense that it sort of like validates, or it opens the door to that conversation, because it's harder to be heard if you don't have someone from the community who's kind of part of that. And these are different. They're very parallel communities, the world of disaster management and disaster behavioral health or disaster human services, but they are also quite different.
Yeah, they're different organizational and professional cultures. Right. And one of the things that we did in the design of this book is every chapter in there has two authors, one from the behavioral health community and one from the emergency management community, so that you get both perspectives on a topic, and then each chapter ends with, how do you make this work in practice? We wanted it to be practical, not just a theoretical textbook kind of thing. So I'm very pleased with how it worked out, but I'm glad it's done.
It sounds like a tremendous amount of work, but it's a great legacy to have put that in place. And I've commented to you, I was telling you earlier how sometimes there's the issue of these fields, we can have the same words mean different things. The word provider or the word vendor, and how that kind of sometimes can become, you can think you're having a conversation about the same thing and you're having very different conversations in the two fields or across these different systems. I also want to talk to you about, what else has sustained you? Because I think one of the things that I know from a lot of experiences, it's important to have something outside of outside of your traditional work that sustains you. And I remember you as an amazing guitar player. So I just wondered if you could just talk about that, music and the arts, and how that has become important to you.
As I mentioned earlier, when I left the public health service, it was an effort to rebalance my life. Yeah. As passionate as I was and am about disaster behavioral health work, I have other interests. Photography, music, and these are interests that I've had since high school. I've been playing guitar since I was 15 years old. And it's always been a source of enjoyment, positive recognition, socialization, getting me connected with people in different kinds of ways. And so I actually worked my way through college and my first graduate school experience playing guitar, and I put that on the back burner for my professional career, and now that I am really retired and living part-time in Canada, where there's a very active acoustic music tradition there, I'm bringing those back to the front burner. So I'm doing a lot of playing, a lot of photography. I've done a couple of books in the popular book sector that combine photography and text. Some that also bring in some of the disaster stuff. My publisher said, I'd like you to do something in one of these books that really reflects your experience that's very unique and what you learned there. And I thought about that. I hadn't thought about it. I said, well, I learned a lot about loss, and I learned a lot about hope. So that book is really about stones and storytelling and what we can learn about loss and hope, and it's become a very popular book for bereavement gifts and those kinds of things. So I found ways to tie together my interests, but I am now really retired, only doing a few things like this to keep my hand in the field that I feel so passionately about. But it's given me the opportunity to bring back onto the front burner some longtime interests of mine.
I just wondered, this is a big challenging question, because looking back at all of this, if you were to kind of distill your work, especially the disaster work, and do, a few lessons maybe about resilience or leadership and care, what would you want people to take away from this?
It's a good question. I think the first on the list would be the resilience of the human spirit. I didn't expect that. And again, I indicated earlier, this wasn't really how I was trained. Right. But the story of how people, individuals, families, communities respond to disasters is a story of resilience, far more than it is illness and disorder. And I preach that gospel anytime I can. One of the lessons was how amazing people who work in disasters are. There's FEMA, and folks like you, and my other colleagues. I mean, these are good people.
Yeah.
Who get criticized too often.
They take a lot of,
but who I'll put my lot in with them any day.
Right.
I've learned things like the centrality of blame. What
does that mean?
You know, we when bad things happen to us, we tend to find fault and find blame, and sometimes there's blame, sometimes there's not. But I do know that if people get caught up in assigning blame and fixating on blame, they move through their recovery from traumatic experiences much more slowly and less linear way than if they don't have that. I learned the importance of people's faith, no matter what that is. And one of the things that I did through disasters almost just about every time I can think of is make sure that the counseling programs were coordinated and integrated with the faith community. People in this country, at least, I think many countries, turn to the faith community before they turn to behavioral health professionals when they're in times of need. And it has nothing to do with my belief. It's just what we are, who we are as a culture. And I think the other thing that I guess I would close with is that I learned that, as I've said probably too much, that this has been an amazing privilege to be part of this and to be with. I can't imagine many more things more rewarding than being with individuals, families, and communities at their darkest hours. And that sounds strange to some people, but for me, it's just an enormous privilege and opportunity. But I think with that privilege comes some obligations. One of those is to be as prepared as you can be. It's frankly not enough just to care. You got to know how to care. You got to know how to behave. You got to know how to interact with other people. You got to know a lot about the things we talked about.
You know how to take care of yourself.
That's right.
In a crisis.
So you have an obligation to be as prepared as you can be in every one of those domains. And the other thing I think is when you're allowed entrance into this dark world of this, we have an obligation to use that exposure to change our lives in positive ways, to take care of ourselves, to be different kinds of colleagues and supervisors and spouses and parents and children, because you can see how fragile those kinds of relationships are, and we need to learn, how to really value and promote those kinds of relationships and change our lives, our own lives, very personally, in positive kinds of ways, and not just kind of deny this happened and move on with something else. So that would be my choice for the last lesson.
Well, thank you so much. All really wonderful and important lessons. I mean, I will just echo that. Having worked with people who worked in some of the worst things you can imagine, darkest moments of human history, certainly our American history. I've come away with the idea of there are certain people who come out of it with a new perspective and a new kind of thought about their potential impact, and again, looking back to their own families, looking to their impact in the world, and for the fragility that, can be there. So I think, I appreciate that. And I appreciate your being here today. And I appreciate your, all that you've shared and the work. And thank you for your service and for your honesty and for helping us, just think about what it means to face these kinds of the worst, and how we can that we can get through them, and that, people do get through them. And it takes a community. It takes I think your description of Oklahoma City in the aftermath is something that, shows the potential that people can come together in the aftermath of really horrific things and show the best side of our human nature.
Thank you for the opportunity of talking with you today. It was great to see you again, and I've enjoyed every minute of it.
Well,
thank you.
Thank you, Brian. So thanks again for everyone for participating and listening to this series, and more to come in the future.